You are now looking live at Buckingham Palace, the home of...
Not yet, they're not.
Very soon, of kings and queens for centuries. But later this morning, it is King Charles III who is preparing to be...
The words were barely a page long. But by the time King Edmund Aldrin pressed his seal beneath them, one of the most sensitive titles in the modern monarchy of Aldrinmark had been quietly severed from the future. Queen Consort Isolde had begun the day as she had begun 1,000 others, dressed for duty, composed for the cameras, certain of her place. She would end it staring at a document that removed her title from every future instrument of succession the kingdom would ever produce. There had been no ceremony, no warning, only Edmund, a pen, and a decision that stunned the palace into silence. Edmund had entered the small council chamber of Thornholt Palace just after dawn, where 2 constitutional advisors waited with the finished order laid flat on a table of dark oak. He read it twice. He removed his glasses, folded them, and set them beside the page. Then he asked for the final line to be read aloud one more time, as though hearing it in another man's voice might change what it meant. It did not. A succession order, in the plainest terms, is a formal instrument that shapes how titles, duties, and continuity pass from one reign to the next. This one stripped Isolde of the designation Queen Consort from every future succession document, ending the automatic constitutional identity she had held beside the crown since her marriage. The wording mattered more than its brevity suggested. Isolde had spent nearly 2 decades moving from public skepticism towards something like acceptance. The title had been proof, hard evidence, etched into law, that the doubts once cast on her marriage to Edmund had not defined her final place in the kingdom's story. Now the language carrying that legitimacy forward had been quietly deleted. Edmund did not rise from his chair after signing. He pressed his fingertips flat against the table and told the advisors, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had delayed this longer than he should have. One advisor would later record the remark in a private account of the morning, not out of malice, but because it revealed something rare, the exhaustion beneath the crown. Isolde received the order at Wren House, her private residence on the palace grounds, delivered by courier before her morning tea had gone cold. She read the first paragraph standing at the window. By the second, she had lowered herself into a chair. By the final line, her shock had curdled into something closer to humiliation. Not because the title itself was disappearing, but because Edmund had not given her the chance to argue, to explain, to be heard one last time before the ink dried. Then came the second blow. A sealed attachment addressed future protocol for royal spouses after any transfer of the crown, and on its confidential circulation list was a name she had not expected to see. Crown Prince Rowan, Edmund's only son and heir. She stared at that single line far longer than she stared at anything else in the document. Edmund, meanwhile, ordered the signed papers distributed to the relevant offices before noon, closing the door on any quiet, face-saving reversal. An advisor hesitated near the exit, glancing back as if to ask whether the king wished to reconsider. Edmund looked up only once. "It stands," he said, and returned to his papers. When Isolde finally summoned the will to confront her husband, her first question was not why he had done it. It was who had convinced him to act now, after years of silence on the matter. When she learned that Rowan's name sat on the circulation list, her expression changed in a way her closest attendant would later describe as something closer to grief than anger, because beneath the shock of Edmund's signature lay a far more painful truth. This had never been only about a title. It was the collision of 3 people who each believed, in their own way, that they were protecting the crown from the others. To the public, the royal family of Aldrinmark stood beneath a single banner, smiling in unison at state functions and charity galas. Behind the palace walls, Edmund, Isolde, and Rowan had each arrived at the same dangerous question from 3 entirely different directions. One saw duty as sacrifice. One saw recognition as survival. One saw the future of the monarchy arriving faster than anyone wanted to admit. The succession order had not created their conflict. It had simply forced 3 private fears into the same room, on the same morning, with no warning given to any of them. Edmund had become consumed in recent years by the question of what would remain after him. In a conversation preserved by one of his longest-serving aides, the king had once admitted that every decision he made now seemed shadowed by what it would mean for Rowan's reign. Continuity, the orderly transfer of titles, duties, and authority from one monarch to the next, had become, in Edmund's mind, the only inheritance that mattered. He feared his son would take the throne carrying not just a crown, but a set of unresolved family wounds bolted onto it. Wounds that no coronation could dissolve. Isolde carried a different fear entirely. The title of Queen Consort was not merely ceremonial to her. It was proof, written into law, that years of public scrutiny had not been the final word on her place in the family's history. Losing it felt like watching acceptance be granted, and then, just as quietly, withdrawn. That evening she sat alone with her sister in Wren House, folding and unfolding the accompanying note until the paper had gone soft at its creases. She did not cry. She only said, quietly, that Edmund knew exactly what the title had meant to her, which was precisely why his silence hurt more than the decision itself. Rowan, for his part, spent that same afternoon standing outside his father's private study, rehearsing questions he never quite found the courage to ask aloud. He understood, better than anyone, that questioning Isolde's future position also meant questioning his father's loyalties, a line he had never wanted to cross. He wanted clarity for the crown he would one day inherit. But guilt trailed him everywhere, because any change to Isolde's status, however constitutional in origin, would look to the world like personal punishment dressed up in legal language. When Rowan finally sat across from his father that evening, he asked the question directly. Had this been a constitutional decision or a personal one? Edmund did not answer directly. Instead, he opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew an earlier draft, and signed, dated months before. The document proved something Rowan had not expected. He himself had once requested a formal review of succession language regarding royal spouses, but he had never asked for Isolde's title to be stripped outright. His father had gone further, entirely on his own initiative. Edmund turned the draft toward his son, but kept one hand resting on it, as if unwilling to fully let it go. His sadness in that moment was unmistakable. He told Rowan that loving someone did not mean every arrangement built around them had to survive forever, that some structures, however well-intentioned, eventually had to be dismantled for the sake of what came after. Then Rowan noticed the date typed at the top of the unsigned draft. It traced back to a night months earlier, a night after a ceremonial gathering at Thornholt, when Edmund and Isolde had argued behind closed doors, and no one outside a small circle of household staff had ever learned why. Once Rowan understood the timing, the succession order stopped looking sudden. It had a beginning, and that beginning could be traced to one precise evening, when a disagreement over ceremony became a private point of no return. That evening had been the Thornholt Continuity Reception, a closed gathering held after senior members of the royal household reviewed the protocols expected to govern Rowan's eventual reign. Isolde had read preliminary papers that evening outlining a reduced formal role for a surviving royal spouse once a new sovereign took the throne, and she had understood immediately what that could mean for her own future. When Rowan became king one day, she feared the woman who had stood beside his father for 20 years could be quietly pushed to the margins of the institution she had devoted her life to serving. After the other guests had gone, Isolde confronted Edmund alone in a private drawing room, the protocol booklet still in her hand. She placed it on the table between them and demanded a guarantee, some binding assurance that her title and her place in the order of precedence would be protected, regardless of who sat on the throne after Edmund. Precedence, in the language of the court, meant simply a person's formal rank within official ceremony. But Edmund, already worn thin by the weight of the review itself, refused to bind his son's future court to promises Rowan had never approved. He would not, he said, make a king's decisions for him from beyond his own reign. Isolde's restraint broke that night. She accused Edmund of accepting 2 decades of devotion while leaving her final status permanently exposed to the whims of whoever came after him. Her voice cracked as she asked whether all those years beside him had earned her nothing permanent, nothing certain. Edmund stood. The accusation had wounded him more than he let show. He told her, quietly but firmly, that the crown could not become compensation for private suffering, that whatever pain their marriage had weathered belonged to their marriage, not to the machinery of state. Isolde stared at him, stunned that he could separate the two so cleanly, as though love and legacy occupied entirely different rooms of the same house. Then she said the sentence Edmund would later write down alone in his own hand, unable to let it go. Then make certain your son understands I was crowned into this family, not borrowed by it. Edmund went completely still. Her demand for permanence frightened him, not because he doubted her, but because he believed, with the stubbornness of a man raised to revere institutions, that authority over succession had to remain entirely with the next sovereign, untethered from promises made in an earlier reign. Before breakfast the following morning, he summoned a constitutional secretary and requested a confidential review of spousal designation beyond his own reign. That review became the unsigned draft Rowan would discover months later. Back in the present, rereading his own handwritten notes from that night, Edmund closed the file slowly, saddened by a truth he could no longer avoid. The order he had signed had been born from the worst argument of his marriage. Isolde remembered that night too, and in the days after the order was signed, she came to believe Edmund had weaponized that old pain, turned one evening of anger into a permanent, irreversible document. So when she crossed the palace corridor toward his study, document in hand, she was no longer trying to save a title. She was trying to learn whether her husband had transformed a single night of grief into the instrument of her erasure. There were no advisors between them this time, no courtiers, no careful constitutional language to hide behind. She closed the study door herself. Edmund remained standing beside his desk. Isolde did not sit for several long seconds. Neither of them spoke first. Then she placed the signed order in front of him and asked the question he had spent months avoiding. Was that night at Thornholt when you decided I could be removed? Edmund asked her to sit. She refused. She wanted no formal audience, no official meeting shaped by rank and protocol. She wanted an answer from her husband, not her king. Edmund finally admitted that the Thornholt argument had begun the review, but insisted the final order concerned succession boundaries, not revenge, the limits separating one reigns. Decisions from the authority of the next. He told her he could not build permanent expectations that Rowan might later be forced to dismantle himself. Isolde's composure broke again. She told him the Queen Consort title had meant more to her than status, that she had spent years being treated as temporary, unwanted, and unforgiven by a public that never quite let her past history go. The designation had told her, in language written into law, that the past had finally stopped chasing her. Now Edmund had taken away the one symbol that made that acceptance feel real, permanent, hers. The king lost his own composure in turn. He told her he had fought for their life together, but he could not rewrite the crown itself to soothe every scar left by that fight. Isolde froze. Those words wounded her more than the order ever had. She pulled a chair sharply away from the desk, but still refused to sit in it. Then she asked the question underneath all the others. Did Rowan want her gone? No, Edmund answered immediately. So quickly it surprised even her. He admitted, in that unguarded moment, that Rowan had asked only for clarity. The decision to remove the Queen Consort designation from future succession instruments had been Edmund's alone. The harsher wording belonged entirely to him. Isolde studied her husband and asked whether more changes were coming. Edmund said nothing. His silence answered for him. She understood in that moment that other continuity decisions, the broader plans governing royal roles across future reigns, remained under review, unfinished, still capable of touching her further. At last she sat. Her anger gave way to something quieter and sadder. She looked away and asked why he could sign an order of this magnitude, but could not bring himself to warn her over breakfast, in their own home, as her husband rather than her king. Edmund had no answer that sounded kind, and he did not pretend otherwise. Before she left the study, Isolde told him that documents did not enforce themselves, that someone inside the machinery of the monarchy held enough influence to make his decision permanent, and she intended to find out who. She left believing she had confronted the man behind the order. But the deeper current of power lived beyond Edmund's study, inside the quiet administrative machinery of succession itself, where signatures mattered less than who controlled what happened to them afterward. Royal power in Aldrinmark, as in most old institutions, rarely announced itself by raising its voice. It sat instead behind a closed file, checked a line of wording, and decided which version of history would become official record. While Edmund and Isolde worked through their private reckoning as husband and wife, Another quieter battle unfolded around the order itself, one Rowan had entered reluctantly, but could not now avoid. The moment he understood exactly what his father had signed, the future king faced a choice: soften the decision's implementation, or ensure no one quietly reversed it once the initial shock had passed. The order now had to move through continuity files, household guidance, ceremonial planning documents, and the formal language used throughout succession preparation, the confidential records used to ready royal duties and authority for a future reign. A signature had created the order. Implementation would give it lasting power. Rowan met privately with the senior official responsible for coordinating those records and was shown two competing versions of the household guidance, one that preserved Isolde's old designation and one that carried his father's new wording. He read both without speaking, his discomfort plain on his face. There was no triumph in it for him, only weight. Rowan asked whether his father understood the emotional cost of implementing the change immediately without any transition period. The official answered, through what would later become a documented account of the meeting, that the king had demanded circulation without delay. That answer troubled Rowan deeply. He feared Isolde would believe he had engineered her humiliation from behind the scenes, and old family tensions made that risk feel dangerously personal. He did not want another wound attached to the reign he would one day inherit. Then Edmund entered the room unannounced. He told his son not to carry responsibility for a decision he alone had made. Rowan answered that responsibility would reach him regardless, because history would inevitably read the order through the lens of his own future succession. Edmund did not argue the point. Instead, he pointed to one instruction buried beneath the new wording. The designation could not be restored by household preference or private agreement. Any reversal would require a new, sovereign-level decision, meaning only a reigning monarch, not staff or family pressure, could formally undo it. Rowan understood it at once. His father had deliberately protected the order from emotional pressure, sealing it against exactly the kind of quiet reversal Isolde had hoped to find. Rowan asked whether Edmund expected Isolde to challenge it. The king looked at him and said simply, "I expect pain to make all of us unreasonable for a while." Then he took the old continuity page, folded it once, and placed it inside the confidential file rather than destroying it. Rowan watched carefully. His father, he realized, was grieving even as he enforced the very change that caused the grief. By evening, the revised instructions had reached Isolde's household, and one line immediately altered a planned public engagement. The title had already vanished on paper, but when Isolde saw her own name printed differently on the next day's official briefing, the decision stopped being abstract constitutional language and became something she could physically feel. The first consequence arrived without any fanfare at all. It appeared on a plain briefing card set beside her morning tea. She reached for it out of habit, expecting the familiar ceremonial wording she had read 1,000 times before. Her hand stopped halfway. Her name remained. Her engagement remained. But the designation printed beneath it had quietly changed. For several seconds, she simply stared at the card, unmoving.